If you listened to Mikey Musumeci on Ariel Helwani's show, you probably heard him say this.
So for now, we're just doing the Fight Pass Invitationals, but UFC has very big plans for grappling. I don't think I'm allowed to talk about them yet,
No
but
problem.
just know that there's very big plans for grappling coming from UFC.
So what are those big plans for grappling that the UFC has? Well, we don't know yet. But since this interview, a couple more details have come out. So today, we're going to take a look at the future of grappling in the UFC. Guys, this is Sean with PDMA, and as you just heard, there is some major news in the grappling world. That is, the UFC is getting more involved in the grappling game. Now, when I say more involved, a lot of you might be familiar with the UFC's current foray into grappling, and that is the Fight Pass Invitational. Those happen periodically, and they have featured some UFC fighters. They've featured some big names in grappling, but now it seems the UFC is going to take another step into getting more involved in grappling. Now, as I just mentioned, the UFC does have a little bit of a foothold in the grappling world with the Fight Pass Invitationals. UFC's been putting these on for a couple of years now, and I actually made a video about it. You can check it out here if you're interested. But the important things to know is that they've been putting on these grappling events to varying degrees of success, and they featured some of the biggest names in grappling. So they were clearly doing some market testing with these Fight Pass Invitationals, whether that was on purpose to plan for something bigger like what we think is coming, or if, just happenstance collecting numbers said, oh, there might be some money in this grappling thing. Either way, it seems that the UFC is looking at what's going on with grappling, probably both with the Fight Pass Invitational and outside, and things like, the popularity of ADCC and CJI and all these big tournaments, and deciding that's where they want to invest their money. And this should really come as no surprise to anybody who's been following all of this. So what do we know so far? Well, we heard Mikey talk a little bit about kind of what his role in this new UFC grappling thing is going to be, but he didn't give a whole bunch of details. And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about Mikey's interview with Ariel in a little bit, just because I think Mikey is a pretty big player in all of this UFC grappling moving forward. But there is somebody who plays a pretty important role in all UFC decisions that recently talked about it, and that's Dana White. In a recent interview, Dana actually talked about how by 2025, TKO, which is the company that the UFC is under, if you're not familiar, TKO plans to dominate in the combat sports world by diversifying into other combat sports. Currently, under TKO, we have the UFC with its various, leagues that they're either a part of or obviously the UFC itself. WWE is also under TKO. I don't think what we're going to talk about really involves them too much, but I don't know. I'm not a big business mogul, so maybe it does.
Here comes the money.
But the point is that part of that diversification strategy does include investing in grappling. And we saw that with the UFC signing an exclusive contract with Mikey Musumeci, as well as being pretty open about discussing, hey, there's plans for some big grappling organization that we're putting together in the future. Dana also mentioned the fact that there are other grapplers that are either signing exclusive contracts or looking to sign exclusive contracts with the UFC. And while we don't know exactly who those grapplers are, sometimes we hear some talk about some things in the biz. I can't believe I just said that. So we don't know who these people are, but rest assured, it sounds like some big names might be in conversation with the UFC for this new grappling league. And one thing that people are really focusing on, and I think maybe a little too much, but I get it, is the fact that Dana mentioned that they want to do some sort of reality show, Ultimate Fighter style thing with jiu-jitsu. And at this point, a lot of you are probably saying, well, Flo already tried that with Who's Next. And yes, Flo did already try that with Who's Next. The success of that, you can talk about it. There was some good jiu-jitsu that came out of it. Some people built their names off of it. So, I'm not going to sit here and hate on Flo. There are plenty of other YouTube channels and Reddit forums where you can do that. But Flo did try this. The important thing to note here is, even if you're not like an Ultimate Fighter fan, even if you weren't a fan of Who's Next, the UFC is behind this. And while the Ultimate Fighter in recent years has been a little, maybe not as well received as in past years, the UFC, you have to understand, is one of the single greatest marketing machines on the planet. And so if they're going to back some sort of reality show, maybe it's not something that you're going to want to watch, but I can pretty much soft guarantee, and I have no insight on this, whatever, but I can say with some confidence that if the UFC is putting something like this together, they're going to have learned from their mistakes and the mistakes of maybe that Flow made, fix those mistakes, and maybe deliver a product that's going to be a little more well received by the grappling community. Or maybe they won't. I don't know. I don't work for the UFC. But I did say that I think everybody's focusing a little too hard on this portion of it, and I get it. That's like pretty sensational, and whenever there's like a thing trying to emulate the Ultimate Fighter, which people definitely tried to do, it makes some headlines, and especially when the UFC's doing it, who put on the Ultimate Fighter in the first place, and it was a large part of their success as a company. But I think people need to zoom out a little bit here, because they didn't just talk about the fact that there's going to be a reality show. We do keep hearing that the UFC is planning to put together a grappling league. You know, Dana kind of mentioned it, Mikey kind of mentioned it, and if I know the UFC, if they're going to build some sort of Ultimate Fighter style program, well, the Ultimate Fighter was meant to feed into the actual UFC league as a whole, or UFC organization as a whole. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of what they're building here. Some sort of grappling league that runs a little bit more like the current UFC. Probably some elements of what One Championship has done well in their grappling league, bringing over to the UFC. And so if there is like this reality show, if that's like something you're not at all interested in, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I think if I know the UFC, they're probably focusing a little bit more on the actual league and are going to use the reality show, you know, as a marketing tool. But let's talk about Mikey Musumeci, everybody's favorite grappler to talk crap about on the internet. I'm just kidding. That's Gordon Ryan. Anyway, okay. But let's talk about Mikey Musumeci, because I think he is a giant part of this happening, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he's the first grappler we heard about signing an exclusive deal with the UFC. And I don't want to make this video a video about like all the reasons Mikey potentially left One Championship. I talked pretty extensively about that in a video I made about One Championship, and I will link that video in the description if that is something you are interested in. But today I want to talk more about the reasons Mikey gave that he believes what the UFC is doing for grappling is actually going to be a good thing. And you don't have to like Mikey, you don't have to, you know, be a Mikey Musumeci fan, nothing like that. But when there is somebody that's this prominent in our sport who's making such claims like this, who just left a major organization to sign with another one, I think we owe it to him to listen to what he has to say. And one of those reasons he gave, which kind of is no real surprise, is that Mikey's very excited that he's going to be now in a tested league. So if you've heard Mikey talk before, you probably know he's not a fan of athletes using PEDs. And there's a whole conversation about that we could have that we're definitely not going to in this video. But, I mean, the guy makes a point. The UFC has the ability to test athletes. And so if there is a movement to clean up the sport, and again, I'm not saying there should be, and I'm not saying there shouldn't be. All I'm saying is Mikey likes having a tested league, the idea of having a tested league. The UFC has the resources to have a tested league, and that actually seemed, in his conversation with Ariel anyway, like a major reason he believes in what the UFC is doing. And if you watched the video or listened to the interview itself, and yes, I'm pulling a lot from this interview, but there's not really much more information out there than that interview, so that's where we're pulling it from. But if you listened to that interview or watched the video, you will have heard Mikey say that he doesn't feel like dealing with shady promoters anymore. And now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm not going to look any further into that statement. He did not say which promoters were being shady, but if you know the people Mikey has dealt with in the past, I can reasonably assume, you know, a couple people he might be talking about. And I guess he sees the UFC as not a shady promoter, which I think is fair. You can accuse the UFC of a lot of things if you want to. I'm not going to. But being shady, I don't really think is one of them. Just judging by friends that I know that actually have fought in the UFC, or people I know that have participated in their grappling cards, or just the interactions I've had with the UFC, I don't think they're a shady organization. And clearly Mikey thinks that this is going to be a way to legitimize grappling as a sport and not have to deal with any more shady promoters, whoever they might be. And so the last interesting point that Mikey made that I want to talk about here is that he thinks it's best for professional grappling if we have one professional league instead of having the current model where it's like, you know, ADCC worlds here and IBJJF worlds and pans and all that here and CJI and then all those Middle Eastern leagues that pay people a bunch of money, but nobody really knows who they are. Instead of all that, he thinks that just like kind of any other major sport, we need to have one home for professional grappling. And I'm not saying I agree with him or disagree with him on that. I think there's a good argument on both sides for it. But if that is his opinion, then it makes perfect sense as to why he would align himself with the UFC. The UFC has established themselves as the dominant name in mixed martial arts, so why couldn't the UFC do that with professional grappling? And so if that's the road professional grappling is going to move down, I mean, I don't think I have to tell you guys, the UFC is actually a pretty logical place for that to end up. And so as always, now it's time to hear what you guys have to say. What do you think about the UFC moving forward with this professional grappling league? Do you think it's going to be a hyper success like their MMA league, or is this just going to end up kind of as one of those other tournaments and ADCC and IBJJF and everything is still going to be prominent? Please let me know in the comments. If you guys have watched my videos before, you know I love the discussion in the comments. I like to get involved in the discussion in the comments, and I really like when I make a video and I take a hard stance on something and then somebody proves that hard stance wrong in the comments. So please drop those comments. Let me know what you guys think. And if you are enjoying this style of content, then please just go ahead and click subscribe. That lets me know that I am making the type of videos that you guys want to watch. With that being said, I am going to sign off. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.